Hello, my name's Jason Lynch. I'm a senior consultant at Pinion Advisory, and over the coming few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about some of the fundamentals and consideration and issues that we work through in relation to irrigation design planning. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about natural resource management with 4 key areas. Land suitability for irrigation. We're going to dive into land capability, and we're going to have a conversation around soils and finish off with some information talking about how we understand irrigation requirements and what that might look like, and we use what's called water balances to determine that. So when we're looking at the big picture to understand, is your land suitable for irrigation? There's a number of, I guess, physical characteristics that we need to work through. We need to look at topography, the slope of the ground, is it north facing, south facing, is it undulating, is it a consistent slope, is it flat, etc. We need to understand and identify what are the soils we're dealing with. We'll dive into that a little bit further on. What are the drainage characteristics of the land? Is the soil free draining? Are there issues with potential waterlogging? Depending on the soil type and the topography, we might look at different types of drainage, subsurface drainage, surface drainage. Aspect, again, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is it south facing or north facing? That's got implications about potential productivity, irrigation requirements, evaporation rates, etc., things like that. Exposure. So this probably feeds back into a little bit of topography as well, but is the site that's looking to be irrigated highly exposed to getting wind? 2 things there: higher evaporation rates, overall irrigation requirements, and then also what does it mean for the centre pivot itself? I think people have heard stories about pivots blowing over. It's a real life thing, and we need to understand about that. What about ease of cultivation? So this feeds back into the soils, but are these soils easy to cultivate? But also understanding what sort of methods of cultivation we might use. Can we or are we required to do just surface cultivation with disc, etc., or do we need to do some sort of deeper cultivation in there? And then finally, and certainly a major consideration, is everything to do with infrastructure. What's the proximity to power lines? What's the issues in relation to pumping elevations? What about roads? What about sheds? Is there anything that's going to restrict swinging pivots over, i.e. is there dams in the way that means that the pivot's not going to go around in a full circuit, or is it going to do a partial circuit? So topography, soils, drainage, aspect, exposure, and ease of cultivation, they can be defined as land capability, which we'll move on to shortly. And then I guess finally, how successful, or can we overcome, and then how successfully can we manage these potential constraints? Can we modify the land through application of fertiliser, drainage, whatever the case may be? Some of these characteristics we can't change. Pretty hard to change aspect, pretty hard to change topography, but there's things that we can modify the land to improve its suitability for irrigation, and also, potential diversification of different enterprises and the intensity they're operated at. So let's have a look at land capability. It's defined or classified, it's an interpretive classification based on permanent biophysical characteristics of the land. Essentially, when you purchase a property or you're managing a property, these are the things that can't change. You can buy the land, but in doing so, you'll receive that land capability that goes with it. These things can't be changed. It's based on a 1 to 7 rating system, and the easiest way to think about it is we've got class 1 land at the top end. It's able and capable to support diverse range of high frequency agricultural uses. for example, we can crop, and we can crop with a lot of different crops, perennial horticulture, but you can also use it for dairying, grazing, red meat, livestock, etc. At the other extreme would be Class 7 land, which is essentially unsuitable for agricultural use. The differences between land capability classes, as I said, it's interpreting these permanent physical characteristics are soil type and depth, elevation, slope, drainage characteristics, the presence of rock and stone, waterlogging, the potential for flooding, how erodible the land is. So that's erosion due to wind movement, scouring, surface water movement, or mass movement, where we're talking about landslips. Climate, so rainfall, exposure to frost, heat unit accumulation and chill hours. And then some of the more individual issues that could limit land's use would be soil salinity. It could be sodicity as well that comes into it. Here's a pretty handy table that I guess lays it all out, but we've got 5 columns in there: land capability, limitations, the choice of crop, the frequency of cropping, and then we've got soil conservation or land management practices on the far right-hand side. So if we go through and have a look at the land capability classes, you can just see we've got 1, 2, and 3. So 1, 2, and 3 is defined as prime agricultural land in Tasmania. And then we've got Class 4. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 are identified as being suitable for cropping as well as grazing use as well. And we can see the limitations range from very minor in Class 1 through to severe limitations in Class 4. Class 1, you can pretty much grow any sort of crop in there, from root vegetable crops, potatoes, through to broadacre crops, cereals, canola, grass seed, etc. And you can see the frequency of cropping on Class 1 soil, high frequency use, 8 to 9 times per 10 years. And there's only limited soil or very minor soil conservation practices. So just have a look on Class 5. That is defined as the break between land that's suitable for cropping and land which is only suitable for grazing. Now, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a significant expansion of irrigation in Tasmania, and it's moved into Class 5 soils. People are successfully cropping Class 5 ground. However, in order to do this, it will require major and careful management. That will relate back to the frequency of cropping that they can do, the type of cropping. Will this land support growing root vegetables? Probably not, but it would be suitable for growing grass seed crops. And then the type of land cultivation practices would be shallow soil surface cultivation, shallow disking, not ploughing this sort of land. Class 5 ground, though, is very productive from a grazing point of view, provided sufficient rainfall or irrigation. So the example for that would be places in the far northwest Tagari, very, very productive. Class 5 down on all the swamp country down in there. Can you crop it? No. Can you grow a lot of pasture for dairying? Yes. And then you can see at the other end of the extreme is Class 7 ground. The limitations are severe to extreme, effectively has little or no agricultural value, certainly unsuitable for cropping. And in terms of if livestock were put on there, 1, will it actually have any pasture on there? Well, that's questionable. 2, therefore, what would we be feeding them on? So they'd be reliant on a supplementary diet. The best example I've got for Class 7 ground would be rocky run country down in the Midlands on the top of elevated ground, or coastal dune country, very sensitive land which really offers little or no agricultural value. Useful for other things, but not for productive agriculture. I should say, and right at the beginning of this, every state does have its own land capability system. The Land Capability Handbook is something which you can refer back to. The land capability information lays it all out. It's quite structured. There is a little bit of interpretation required in there, but useful if you need to understand how it might work in your property and land holdings. Maybe let's have a look at an example of a few different GIS layers looking at the same piece of ground. You can get all this information off the list. It's a very useful repository of information. Let's just have a look at on the top left image. We've just got a centre pivot with the blue circle laying around the outside. We can then flick on to look at a soils layer. So in that image there, to the north of it, or towards the top of the screen, we've got a Kinburn, we've got Cressy in the middle, and we've got a Brumbury on the bottom. You know, these soils are all quite different in terms of their textures. Yes, they can all be irrigated, but they will behave quite a little bit differently in terms of potential exposure to drainage requirements, soil moisture holding capacity, soil fertility potential. You know, it's very important to understand, if we're going to start irrigating our land, what are these soils we're dealing with? In many areas of Tasmania, we can have quite rapid changes of soils in the topography. They can be quite subtle changes in topography, but when you start putting a spade in the ground, you can move from a duplex with a sandy loam over a heavy clay underneath, or we can go to a loamy soil that's quite deep, or we can have a clay in there. Top right image, that relates to a drainage map. The white lines that have been put on there, they are indicative of the soils changes as we look back to the left-hand side. In this image here, we can see on the right-hand side of that, there's an interpretive scale. For this location here and for all these soils, they're sort of rating between either side of being imperfectly drained. What does that mean? It means these soils don't cope well with being over-irrigated. They can be prone to becoming waterlogged. So in terms of irrigation scheduling, that has to be well managed and appropriately dealt with. On the bottom left, that's a layer showing waterways, natural waterways, but also man-made form drainage lines in there. We should try and understand pretty early on the potential surface water movement from creeks and drains. The list picks these up very well, but we then have to understand, are some of these waterways, are they permanently there? Is there always water flowing in them? Are they ephemeral? Do they have a particularly large catchment, which could lead to inundation? Are there things that we need to look at in terms of installing drainage on there to divert and collect water from before it comes onto the property, onto the pivot side, I should say? And then also, is there the opportunity to install drains to deal with the expected additional amount of irrigation water that can be applied? Bottom row in the middle picture, that is from the land capability layer. We can see the bright yellow colour, that's land capability class 3, and to the north and south of that, we've got class 4 land. Pretty common to see something like this, especially through the Midlands and Meander Valley, where we may have differences of land capability under the same irrigation system area. What does that mean? In a perfect world, we try and manage the land capability areas separately. It doesn't work like that. You won't be able to manage it like that in most cases, but it does mean that we really should manage the land for the weakest issues. So, land class 4, we can't crop that anywhere as frequently as class 3. So we've got to be careful about how we choose to do it. The suitability of potentially root crops in class 3 soil, yes, could be a goer, but that might not work out on the class 4. Kilburn soils might not take it very well. They might not have enough depth. Same with Brumby on the south side in there. And on the bottom row, far right-hand side, this is a topography map showing slope in there, quite detailed, taken off the list. It's picking up the drainage lines, it's picking up the natural waterways, and it's showing that being strongly sloped. So that's effectively the little drainage banks that are leading into it. Very, very useful if we've got to start dealing with sloping ground, especially where we've got a variation across the ground itself, where the pivot might be moving from flat ground up and over an elevation. Too much elevation can cause some problems, particularly undulating ground can put a lot of pressure on infrastructure and things like that as the towers move across. I'd urge you to get familiar with the list. All these layers plus many, many more are on there, and it's a really, really good start to just understanding and giving some good forward warning about what we could deal with, and then also what we might have to intervene and manage differently going forward in terms of drainage, etc., soil mitigation, in terms of putting on lime or whatever the case may be to make sure it's sustainable and productive over the long term. So sticking with land capability, if we look at it, it certainly directly influences the potential land use activity, the type of land use activity, the management actions that we might have to undertake, the irrigation infrastructure, depending on the soil type, depending on its infiltration rates and permeability and drainage, we might have to change up the nozzle packs on it, the scheduling, etc. And ultimately, what's the potential productivity associated with that land? And finally, the economic outcomes. So worst case scenario would be if we started pushing the system too hard, often the land will cope with increased utilisation and intensity of use for a period of time, but gradually things will start to come undone. Soils become less capable of accepting irrigation water, rooting depth might be compromised, so potentially productivity falls away, the economic outcomes are diminished, but we've got this very expensive infrastructure in there. So we've got to really understand what we can do and how we can do it. This is just a quick rundown on, I guess, land management practices that promote and lead to sustainable land use outcomes. So firstly, most importantly, we've got to have an appropriate balance between cropping and an extended pasture phase. So, you know, are we cropping 2, 3, 4 years in a row and then we go back into pasture for an extended period of time? Whatever the case may be, but when it does go into pasture, the pasture also should be well looked after. It should be productive. It's a time when we'll recruit soil carbon. It's a time when the soil structure gets a rest and the fine root material will allow things to moderate and, you know, effectively next time we do come back into cropping, we should be able to continue on as we previously did. Drainage is critical. So understanding what we need to do in terms of surface and subsurface drainage, and there's great contractors around that can help with that. Do we need to install cut-off drains and diversion drains? So they're the ones that will push water from a higher elevation point or upstream and move it around a drainage area. How are we going to deal with sodic subsoils? These are very common through many areas of Tasmania, particularly through the Midlands and southeast Tasmania, where these soils being sodic, they're dispersive. When they get wet, they swell, they can cause erosion. All of a sudden your drains start to move further and further wider. We start getting scouring. It's not good. What do we do? In many cases, we'll need to probably treat those areas, ameliorate any conditions that we've got with pH, and then try and grass them down as soon as possible. And then the wonderful world of VRI, which I think is going to get discussed further on, but do we need to invest money with variable rate technology just to, I guess, enhance existing drainage that we've got there. It's a big topic, and I know it is going to get discussed a little bit further on in these presentations. We do need to adopt an approach of minimal tillage. We should not be over-cultivating the soil. So, yes, we do need to use powered implements from time to time, but they shouldn't be our first go-to implement. Surface cultivation is always to be adopted where we can get away with it relative to the crop what we're growing, and the nature of, is it something that we're working into the soil, or are we having to work up pasture with a root mat or something like that? And then we really should avoid cultivating the subsoil. So particularly on duplex soils in the Midlands with that clay soil, subsoil underneath, don't put your rippers into it. Don't try and bring that to the surface and mix it through the topsoil. It does not work like that. It does not work that way. So keep the subsoil down where it should be. We need to adopt correct irrigation scheduling practices. So two parts of that would be understand the crop's water requirements, understand the soil's moisture holding capacity, understand the crop growth stage and its water requirements as they change over the season. For pasture, that's driven by the weather conditions, wind, rainfall, etc., and heat unit accumulation. For something like potatoes, that varies significantly as we go through with tuber set to crop senescence and things like that. We need the correct soil fertility levels. It is not a case of the higher the nutrient levels, the better it is. We should achieve the ideal or the optimal for phosphorus, the potassium and sulfur, and then the other macro and micro elements. There's a lot of information out there that we can obtain which will tell us what the correct soil fertility level should be, and pH as well. Soil test on a regular basis. That should reflect the intensity of their land use and also expectations that we assume that we can drive out of it. So the harder we drive the land, the more we're going to have to watch soil fertility. Wherever possible, it would be great to incorporate crop stubbles. And if it works out and it's practical, grow green manure crops. These are a major source of soil carbon. We know all the good things that adds into it with soil moisture holding capacity, soil biological activity, etc. It's not always possible to do it, but if it works in the system, try and incorporate your stubbles and try and grow green manure crops. Not to be done lightly, because we've got to understand the implications around things like incorporating crop stubbles. What could that mean for things like slug pressure or lucerne flea, regularly earth mites? And if we're going to grow green manure crops, at some point we potentially need to incorporate them into the soil. Is that the right thing to do, or can livestock come along and take the top off? But the root mass underneath is what we want. It helps with soil drainage, helps remediate the soil. So doing both of those things is a really, really good management pathway. And then finally is aeration. Livestock moving on irrigated ground can often cause some surface compaction. It's generally not that deep. It's often only between, say, 50 and 100 mils deep. Being able to use a spike tine or a specific blade aeration equipment can really help with this. Helps with irrigation drainage going through, certainly helps with the plants we're trying to grow underneath, be they clover, be they grass. So aeration is a great tool, and certainly something that we may need to adopt. Put spade in the ground. If you've got access to a penetrometer, there are some specific numbers around when it starts indicating that the soil's compact and exceeding the compaction limits for pastures or crops for that matter as well. Let's move on to the topic of soils. So we could talk about this all day, but let's just go into it. All soils have got quite unique properties. They can sort of look the same texture-wise, but when they really start coming down to it, they do behave quite differently in terms of irrigation. So what we're looking at there is the soil moisture holding capacity, drainage, permeability, how well the water can move through the profile. And at the end of the day, they will directly influence and determine the irrigation setup and scheduling. So understanding what soil type you've got there, we can go back to the list and help with that, or go to your advisor, your agronomist, to help you understand what this means. But let's just have a look at a little example. We've got a table here with soil texture, raw, which is the readily available water. So that's the water that the plants can take up. Total water will be much higher than that, but plants can only use only a portion of that. And then we've got a couple of columns looking at the infiltration rate for millimetres per hour. So 3 soil types on there: sand, sandy loam, and clay loam. So we can see with the sand, the readily available water is 3 millimetres per 10 centimetres. Sands don't hold a lot of water. It moves through the profile, generally rapidly draining in most cases. At the other extreme are these very, very fine textured clay loams. They can hold a lot more moisture, 8 millimetres per 10 centimetres of soil. So in terms of how frequently we need to irrigate, that's got a major impact on it. Obviously, on a sandy soil, we need to irrigate on a very frequent basis because the soils just don't hold enough moisture. Whereas on a clay loam, we might be talking about larger volumes being applied, but on a less frequent basis compared to a sandy soil. Let's have a look at the infiltration rate. So we've got 2 columns there. We've got an average structured soil. So this might be something which has undergone a mixed cropping livestock use. Sandy soils, again, very free draining. They'll move 50 millimetres of moisture per hour through the profile. And then we've got sandy loam and we've got clay loams, about 20 millimetres per hour. So if we got rainfall or we applied more irrigation than what the soil could take in, we'll see things like ponding on the soil surface, leads to leaching, etc., and things like that, and surface water movement. Not good for the plant roots, not good for nutrient retention. But then have a look on the right-hand side in the well-structured. So sand, we'll just move on from that, and we can happily say that they are well-structured. They really didn't have structure to begin with, but that's fine. But let's have a look at the sandy loam. So if a sandy loam's been well looked after, the infiltration rate in that can go from 20 in the average up to 45 millimetres per hour. Clay, 20 millimetres per hour, and well-structured scenario can be as much as 20 millimetres per hour. So a significant change, and certainly something that if we're looking after the soil structure, watching out for our tillage methods, the frequency of cultivation and the pasture phases, and potentially are we incorporating crop stubbles, it is of a significant benefit in terms of the frequency of irrigation, infiltration rates, and that whole package around, is it good soils and good conditions for the plants to grow in? They take their water and their nutrients up through the roots. If those roots aren't performing in an ideal situation, we'll get a yield penalty, be it growing less grass or potato yields or wheat yields get reduced. So if we do have degraded soils, and nothing beats putting the spade out and having an understanding of the soil structuring score and things like that, or we're on sloping ground because the water's going to move off from high slope down to low slope rapidly, we need to undertake a different approach to irrigation scheduling. So with degraded soils and sloping ground, typically we're talking about lower volumes of water applied on a more frequent basis. If we irrigate them just the same as we would with a well-structured soil or on flat ground, we will potentially waste a lot of water. We're going to get surface water movement off. It's going to go from the high ground to the low ground, potentially saturate low ground. Not good for the plants, a waste of a resource, nutrient leaching, etc. Altogether, not what we should be aiming to do. Let's just have a quick dive into how this might work in terms of an operational case, but let's just look at a summer irrigation scheduling for a grass-based pasture, wherever that may be. We're talking about grasses with a 20 centimetre root zone on a sandy loam soil. So sandy loam soils holding 7 millimetres per 10 centimetres, so 20 centimetre root zone, double that, 14 millimetres in 20 centimetres of soil. And we've got an irrigation system set up to apply 15 millimetres per application. We can calculate the irrigation frequency using a pretty simple calculation in there that, looking at this table here, we've got the month, November, December, January, February, and March. The top row is the daily evapotranspiration rate. Evapotranspiration rate refers to the moisture lost to the atmosphere through just normal evaporation, but also the moisture that moves through the plant and is effectively released through the leaf area. So it's combined, what's used by the plant and what gets lost to the evaporation. In this case here, let's just look at the Northern Midlands, and we can see at one end in November, late spring, 4 to 5 millimetres per day for pasture. At the other end, we've got March, 3 to 4 mils per day, peaking in January and February. Certainly can be higher than this. Hot, windy weather, we can easily see evapotranspiration rates getting up towards 8, 9, even 10 millimetres per day in extreme cases. So underneath, if we look at the irrigation frequency, so this is the number of days between applying the 15 millimetres. So back in spring, late spring, I should say, in November, about every 5 to 6 days, if we apply 15 millimetres, the plants will happily be growing and we're not going to be coming unstuck in terms of creating moisture stress. And you can see as we get further and further into summer, in January and February, on a sandy loam soil with a system set up to apply 15 millimetres per application, we need to do that every 3 to 4 days. In practice, it often is about 3 days. And as I said, we've got to be able and capable of dealing with extreme events. So we could be irrigating less than every 3 days and the irrigator might not get a rest at all. We get to early March and things will start to slow down for pasture. It's a shorter day length, it's cooler. That's driving lower evapotranspiration rates and the irrigation frequency drops back to every 5 to 6 days applying 15 millimetres. The complicating factor over all of that would be what rainfall are we getting in the meantime? That might change things up a little bit. Are we getting pasture irrigation scheduling right? Here's a couple of quick, easy reads. So in this table here, we've got pasture species, a grazing trigger can be pretty handy. Are we getting it right? Success. Rotation length, that's going to tell us a lot if it's growing quick enough. And then if we're measuring the growth rates, we can work that out in terms of is the plant under any moisture stress. So let's look at ryegrass. We should be able to graze that when we get to the 2.5 to 3 leaf stage or it hits canopy closure. So if the leaves start leaning over on top of themselves, we should be grazing, and that can occur at the 1.5, 2 leaf stage. We should be able to reach that during summer or spring, summer to early autumn. Every 20 to 25 days, we should be reaching that grazing trigger, and our pastures should be growing at 70 to 80 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. Now, it certainly can get faster than that. We can see 90 to 100 under ideal growing conditions. Let's look at white clover. So the grazing trigger for that is take that back. With white clover, the grazing trigger is 15 to 20 centimetres in height. Not a problem to have it set stocked, no problems at all. Probably try not to get it longer than 15 to 20 centimetres. If it was regularly, we'd be able to up the stocking rate in there. About every 25 days, we should be able to graze our white clover or alternatively set stock it. But if we are set stocking it, let's have a look at these pasture growth rates in there for white clover. We should be achieving 70 to 80 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. Now, again, like ryegrass, we can often see white clover getting up to 90 and 100, even higher than that. White clover certainly isn't suppressed by hot temperatures like ryegrass, so it will grow quite regressively under hot weather conditions. So if we're getting our irrigation scheduling right for pasture, we should be able to get that sort of productivity. So let's finish off to have a look at the concept of water balances. So we use these to calculate an enterprise, a crop, pasture, vines, potatoes, whichever we want to look at it, to understand what the irrigation water requirements are. A water balance is driven by the rainfall that we've received, how much, when does it fall, the evapotranspiration rates, the concept of a crop factor. So what that is, it's a measure of a plant's water use efficiency. Some plants are very efficient at using water. Perhaps something like lucerne with a deeper root system, the ability to grow a lot of dry matter with not a lot of water. At the other end might be something like a potato, for example, which doesn't have a particularly high crop factor. Certainly can have a lot of biomass produced on it, but it does need a lot of water to do that. And then the last thing is, with water balances, they can be corrected for best practice irrigation. So that might relate to how frequently are we able to run the centre pivot, what's the setup on there in terms of the nozzles. So, you know, if we do a really, really good job, we'll be able to get the best out of the plant. Perhaps if we're not, due to infrastructure limitations, then these need to be moderated a bit back. So it's really important, though, when we're looking at water balances, we would use them in scenarios of potentially how much water in megalitres is coming from a dam or out of the TI pipeline or out of a river or out of a creek. What are we using that water for elsewhere on the property? Are we using it for frost protection measures for vines? Do we use it for stock water? Do we use it for dairy washdown? So if we did a water balance up and we worked out our enterprise was going to use 200 megalitres of water, and that conveniently worked out our dam was, you know, 200, 210 megs, we go, this works out well. But we must take in consideration, is this also where we draw our stock water? And we do a little quick calculation and go, yeah, look, you know, in a season, we might have to allocate 30 or 40 megs for stock water. Potentially, we might be growing too much crop. And if we can't fully irrigate it, it's pretty questionable how the productivity is going to go down and the economics associated with it. As I've said, when we're using these water balances, do them pretty early on to understand how much water we might require in any given year. That might help us work out what sort of water purchases we require. Have we got enough irrigation entitlements? And then, most importantly, seasonal irrigation scheduling. How are we going to get our water to fully irrigate our crops all the way through? Potentially, there's a changeover from doing a bit of spring irrigation, finishing crops out, poppies, cereals, etc., going into main season irrigation during summer on pasture or potatoes, whatever the case may be. So combined with land capability and the soil type information, we use these water balances to really help us work out what we need to do with irrigation infrastructure design requirements. So understanding all this, do we need to increase the size of our dams? Do we have sufficient capacity in storage? Are the pipeline diameters big enough to shift enough water quick enough in the period of time we require? What about pump duties? Are we looking at different types and styles of irrigation schemes? Is it centre pivots? Is it a traveller? Is it a solid cess system? And then finally, the outlet at the other end, the sizing of the nozzle packs. All the information that we've talked about in the concepts of land capability, soils and water balances helps us define this and really take the guesswork out of it, or what might work for someone else in your district or down the road may not exactly be just right for you. You've got to take in considerations your own circumstances. So this is what a water balance looks like. Pretty busy table in there, but if we just start with the top section, so we've got quite a bit of data relating to the climate, and then the bottom sections relating to the water requirements, which is driven by climate. So we've got the months along the top, July through to June. We calculate evaporation, or we obtain the evaporation information. We can get this from the Bureau of Meteorology. There's a couple of sites around Tasmania, or we can use Silo, which provides a detailed, sufficiently robust modelling for evaporation rates across Australia. We've got rainfall, and in this case here, we're looking at a median rainfall scenario for each month. We've got it discounted for what we call effective rainfall. So not all the rain that lands, comes out of the sky is going to be effective. We get a little bit of surface evaporation, we get some surface runoff. So we discount that by 30%. And then we've got a little calculation of a monthly deficit. So between the rainfall, between the evaporation and what we discount for what's being effective, we come up with a monthly deficit as we go through. Go down to the next layer. We're talking about pasture in this case here. Best practice management. So we're assuming everything's being operated and managed well. We've got a row for the crop factor. So we can see for pasture, in the middle of winter, it's down about 0.4. Go all the way through to the height of summer, it's about 0.9. We have an evapotranspiration estimate. So that's evaporation times the crop factor, and we can see that extend throughout the year. Not a lot gets used in winter for the evapotranspiration rates. 15 thereabouts for July and June, and then we take it all the way through to January in this example here, where we're getting a deficit evapotranspiration rates of well over 100, 125, 130 millimetres per month. Then we can calculate the irrigation requirements. So we can see we're talking about the evapotranspiration rates minus the effective rainfall. So it zeroes itself out during winter. And then gradually as we slide in through spring and into summer, we can see more and more irrigation is required to avoid the plant going into moisture stress. Roughly speaking, in this example here, it's around about 499 millimetres of moisture per hectare, which equates to 5 megalitres per hectare. And the last row in there is just expressing it in megalitres per hectare requirements. We need a bit of data that sits in behind that, but it is so important during the design phase, someone takes this into consideration and someone does the calculations on it. Moving slightly sideways with respect to water balances, one of my colleagues, Fletcher Pegas, produced. What we've got here is the index of average rainfall variability across Tasmania. So the very dark blob that we can see on the west coast, there is not a lot of variation in rainfall. The difference between they're very, very wet and they're very, very dry isn't significant. They don't get exposed to either ends of those, so they get quite consistent rainfall. As we move further east in Tasmania, we can see that we're getting a lot more variability in our rainfall, particularly on the east coast, and perhaps as we start going out into the northeast to a degree in Flinders Island. What that shows is that there's a big difference between the very, very dry and the very, very wet. When we've got a westerly dominant weather system comes through, dumps rain on the west coast, by the time we get to the east coast, there's not a lot left. But then we go through these periods when we get these big east coast low patterns coming through, and it can get very, very wet in there. What does this mean? Well, our irrigation systems, our water balances and the irrigation infrastructure, it has to be geared up that we can deal with potentially quite a few years of where maybe we're dealing with, on the East Coast, potentially 5.5 megalitres year in, year out. but we go through these very, very wet years where potential irrigation requirements can fall down to 3.5 megalitres per hectare, or they can go the other way. When we're in westerly systems, westerly weather, climate patterns, and there's no assistance from rainfall, the irrigation requirements can jump up to 6 to 7 megalitres per hectare. So I think it's a very useful bit of information to understand when we're designing our irrigation schemes in these dry areas of Tasmania and areas that are influenced from East Coast weather systems, that potentially we have to be able to shift a lot of water over the year to make sure that we're fully irrigating our livestock, irrigating our pastures for livestock and irrigating our crops. As we move further to the west and the northwest, the type of ability to irrigate and deal with the very dry to very wet becomes less and less. So we're talking about less complex systems. Maybe it means that on the Midlands and the East Coast, we're over-engineering systems to cope with the dry periods, but it is what it is. The future climate predictions for Tasmania are telling us we will expect similar amounts of rainfall into the future. However, they are telling us that that rainfall will become more concentrated in winter and in spring, less rainfall in summer. Autumn is very variable. We've been dealing with that for recent years. And then the upshot of all that is higher evaporation rates. So going forward in time, it probably ends up meaning that our irrigation systems have to be able to deal with greater variability, potentially less assistance from rainfall during the summer growing season. All in all, what does this mean? Well, we've got to prepare for the future now. We've got to have our systems that are being installed now to be able to deal with variability going into the future. And if they are having to be engineered, so be it, but it'll give us that consistency of productivity over time going forward. Let's just have a look at two examples of water balances across from Central East Coast, Cranbrook. Let's have a look at Mella in the very far northwest. So you can see with these figures on there, we've got the months along the bottom, July through to June, and then on the vertical axis, we've got irrigation requirements of megalitres per hectare. This is an example where we're both looking at pasture in there. The orange columns, we're talking about in a medium rainfall year for Cranbrook, 580 millimetres, requires 5 megalitres per hectare. On for Mella, in a medium rainfall year, 928 millimetres. And on average, with that amount of rainfall, we'd need 3.5 megalitres. Here's an interesting one. Look at Cranbrook. In the 90th percentile rainfall, 945 millimetres, it needs 2.5 megalitres. Mella, on average, gets a similar amount, 928 millimetres, but it actually needs a bit more, 3.5 megs. Why? Because when we get those really wet years in Cranbrook, the rainfall doesn't typically fall out of the sky during winter and spring. It's actually falling out of the sky during summer. Hence, the irrigation requirements fall off. You can see when it is very dry on the East Coast, those irrigation requirements pop up in those dry years where they're receiving, on average, 430 millimetres. Irrigation requirements jump up to about 6.8 megalitres per hectare. And in Mella, in the dry years, I should say, when the rainfall potentially drops down to 635 mils, irrigation requirements about 5.1 megs. So if we look at it on the East Coast, picking on Cranbrook as the example, rainfall spread throughout the year. Typically, there's no, except for those wet years when it does fall significantly during the summer months, it would require 180 to 280 irrigation season in a median rainfall year of about 580 mils. For Mella, it's mostly a winter dominant rainfall pattern. and it would require about 150 to 180 day irrigation season in a median rainfall year. And we can see in Cranbrook, you know, in a median rainfall year with the orange columns, irrigation starts up in September, and typically by October, November, it's in full swing. In Mella, irrigation starts a little bit potentially in October, but typically it's in full swing towards the back end of November and well and truly into December. So where to from here? Look, I'd encourage everyone to get familiar with the use and the operation of the list. There's a couple of links on there. The YouTube one is, I guess it's a guide to how you can access information. We are unique in Australia that's a public available list with a list of information and the repository of data that's on there in such a huge array of what we can extract out of it. It's kept up to date. There's everything on there from water licenses and dams and types of vegetation, plus all the agriculture related side of things. The Great Bill Cotching with Soil Health for Farming in Tasmania. There's the electronic version of that book on there. This book's been around for a while, but it's so fundamental in terms of land management practices, drainage, cultivation, soil fertility. It's an excellent publication, and I'd urge you to access that one. Then we've got the Tasmanian Soil Extension Program. So really good information relating to soil fertility and land drainage. You can see the link on there through the NRM North portal. Always keep up to date with the climate data that's available. I use the Swan Systems one. You can use plenty of different apps out there. We want rainfall, evapotranspiration, temperature, wind and humidity if you can get access to it. It's really useful to know what's coming. And, you know, a lot of decisions get supported based on what we can see coming with the weather. And then I'd also give a plug to Farming Forecaster. Why, when we're talking about irrigation? Well, there's a wide number of locations of soil moisture probes in the ground. Very useful once we start seeing dryland country dropping off the soil moisture. That's our trigger to start turning on the centre pivots as we go through, or travellers, or solid set systems to keep the spring pasture growth all the way through summer and into autumn. Thank you. Good luck.